Thank you, Creative Armenia, for inviting me to speak here today. This is my first time in Armenia and also my first time being in Yerevan. I'm going to tell you a story today which is partially about how we can read a city, and I'm going to give you some examples. And the other part of my story will be about how we, in our practice, implement the thinking about context, about tradition, about history in architecture, in our own buildings. So, I have a couple of instruments here that I need to... Yes. So, I will first tell you something about what I would say is the main question for me, which is hidden behind this beautiful title of the lecture. That is, what is actually, if we strip everything, what is contemporary architecture nowadays? There are many answers to that. I would like to tell you that my story pivots actually around this question today. So, allow me to take a detour by giving you some examples before I end up with showing how I personally would give an answer to this difficult and complex question. So, when I am traveling through Europe, visiting a city center, for example, I often find myself wondering that it's hard to tell where I'm actually located. Sort of a new exception of a sort of new perception of being lost, you could say, because everything seems to merge and it starts to look alike. So I would say that public space in generally tends to be totally commercialized, and every company or chain is represented in virtually every city, big city, but also small-scale city. I would say to the loss of local shops, small initiatives. And then I often have to think about this idea of the generic city. That's an idea that was coined by the Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas. He wrote a text in 1994 which is describing the merging of identity or the disappearance of character. And he wonders, is the contemporary city like the contemporary airport? All the same, he questions. Now, 30 years later, I would say Koolhaas' exploratory text has actually become a sort of reality throughout Europe and actually also beyond. Entire city centers are being redesigned in order to accommodate this phenomenon of moving towards a generic atmosphere. A similar development can be found in growing cities, growing economies, cities and countries that have an ambition to grow and to have the tendency to globalize. A place such as Beijing, where the original typology of a hutong has rapidly diminished. So these are small improvised housing blocks built collectively and mostly in small scale. So very labyrinthic and also very sympathetic. Now, in the giant force of urbanization, the city has started to a process of heavily densification and with rather generic tall condominiums, resulting in the tragedy of destroying the majority of these hutongs. Just a fraction of these original buildings is remaining. And of course, the development of a city can be perceived over time as a sort of wave. Progress requires improvement, of course, and of everyday standards. That's what we all long for. Yet the process of renewal and upgrading of a city is a development that I think requires vigilance and carefulness. and fully understand a sense of place and appreciating this sense of place. Because before you know it, the result is that most of the local identity is vanished and yet another new generic city is born. So I will tell you a bit closer to me, because here we're in Beijing, the case of Amsterdam as an example. Perhaps some of you have been in Amsterdam. So to illustrate this development of growth and upgrading, and to also acknowledge the fact that the reading of a city changes over time, and that the city has many layers that you can actually activate and embrace, I would like to give you a bit of a background on how Amsterdam has developed. So let's start by describing the current Amsterdam. This is the candy that we see when we visit Amsterdam, the beautiful city with its canals and its historical housing, which is rather intact nowadays. And I think this is already popular since I would say, the 70s. Amsterdam is a very popular tourist destination with visitors from all over the world already for decades. So the city has been benefiting from these profits of tourism already for quite a time. And yet in recent times, the signs of discomfort start to appear. So the mayor of Amsterdam is building up all kinds of restrictions for mass tourism to avoid to continue. For example, by prohibiting new Airbnb settlements. And the prices of real estate have been risen to such a height that the majority of people is actually unable to buy a house any longer in the city center. So, because in the city, it is actually more profitable to run a shop on the ground floor than to inhabit the full house with all its floors. So, resulting in streets having small houses with ground floors completely occupied by shops, which happen to sell all the same stuff, products, and being vacant above. So you have actually uninhabited streets. So the city is gradually turning into an uninhabited city, while the strength of a city, I think, is the dynamics of its street life and inhabitation, of course. Now, to go a bit further back in time, it has been different. During the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Amsterdam was appreciated differently. At that time, the general public opinion was that the old city center, with its beautiful canals, was old rubbish. So, with old houses requiring loads of maintenance, completely not in pace with the demands of modern society at that time. So instead, people were actually longing to live in the modern city, offering new types of comfort, such as easy accessibility by car, more vegetations, buildings that would actually not leak and would be easily to be heated, and offering also the latest installations. Now, the new city extension of the Bijlmer, as this neighborhood is called, was such a place. It was realized in 1966 and it was popular. And a load of people moved over there, leaving the old dirty city center behind, embracing the modern living. As a result, the buildings in the city center were bought by real estate agents that would either leave these old historical buildings vacant or would demolish them in order to realize new buildings, more modern buildings, in the middle of the historical center, making quite a contrast with the original historical buildings. Meanwhile, in the end of the 70s, society had gradually started to change again. Many young people were in search for a place to inhabit, for a house. And the housing market did not offer a sufficient amount of housing. Because of this, and also because of reasons of protection of historical heritage, a protest movement was building up. The so-called squatters movement was born. Alternative groups of youngsters were occupying vacant buildings in the city center, in the historical city center, and inhabited these. And they were rather disruptive, and they were fighting against the police. So, with a so-called do-it-yourself mentality, these squatters organized everything themselves. Partially, this was an opportunistic motive, of course, because they wanted a house. And it was also not so nice for the, let's say, smaller real estate agents, because legislation did not really allow them to kick out these occupying groups. It was actually a sort of siege in the inner city. Yet simultaneously, the good side is that a substantial amount of heritage buildings has survived this phenomenon because of the squatting. So this was a sort of revolution that took place over approximately, I would say, 20 to 30 years. And ironically, ever since, one could say that the popularity of the city has grown to such an extent that the coin has flipped again, because the saving of heritage buildings by the squatters movement and other participants has proven to be so successful that the city nowadays becomes harder to inhabit due to its popularity. Now, all the heritage buildings have such a strong attraction that they have become priceless. And the modern Bijlmer neighborhood, by the way, has been heavily transformed into a more cozy environment. So the city constantly changes. So one can have quite some questions about and discussion about this phenomenon of change. But it's also a narrative about layers of time, I would say, in a city that make the conglomerate of a city. Now, by walking through your beautiful city the past days, I also encountered such layers in time. And old Yerevan in tough stone, beautiful layer of Soviet buildings, and an urge for progress, for new buildings, offering new standards of living. This addresses the question of how your beautiful city can add a new layer of contemporary buildings, I think, without losing the qualities of the existing. So, in such a way that it can grow into the future without ending up becoming another generic city. So, what is actually the genius loci of Yerevan then? And how can you maintain the character of Yerevan and let it simultaneously grow? Would be a question, I think. This brings us back to the question of the beginning. How can we make contemporary architecture that is rooted and connected to a context, which is rather, I would say, a delicate balancing act or a complex discussion? But I do think it is part of the tasks of architects and urbanists to discuss and reflect on this and develop a general position in this. And perhaps these words have been rather abstract so far. Therefore, please allow me to also show you some projects from our practice, how we in our practice deal with these questions, not as the best example, but perhaps as a route for making contemporary architecture. So, as a habit, when I'm lecturing, I tend to explain why we are using this peculiar name for our office, mainly because this illustrates, I would say, our attitude. So, the word Monadnock stands for a type of mountain, and we found this out only after an encounter with this beautiful building in Chicago. So, in the downtown Chicago, within the loop, you have these old, beautiful structures. This building is called the Monadnock building. It was realized in 1892, and it's still there. It's still standing there, you can still visit it. It's beautiful. And we fell in love with this building for several reasons. Now, I can actually give a full lecture on this building only. I will not do that now. But I do want to show you some of its beauty. There's a lot to tell about this building, but one of the most important parts is that it exists of two parts, two different parts, and two different architects have been designing this building. So one was Holabird and Rush, and the other one was Burnham and Root. Now, when I talk to people, when I'm traveling around, and I ask them which part is new and which part is old, there's always a sort of, let's say, discussion, because people tend to choose the right part, which is more abstract, as the most modern and young part, and the old part being the more decorated part. It's the opposite. The right part is built out of massive brick, and the left part is built in the modern material of steel. So the right part took about, I would say, from the beginning to the end, approximately 10 to 12 years to get realized. And it's one of the tallest brick structures in the world. There are more tall brick structures in the world, but this is one of them. And the other one, by Holabird and Rush, took only 2 years. I think perhaps from the first sketch to the opening of the building. So that's interesting, I think, but that it's on the edge of a changing building culture. But the other interesting thing is that Holabird and Rush, as a couple of architects, felt the urge to decorate the building with quite figurative ornaments, while the other part, designed by Burnham and Root, is much more abstract. It has a different type of ornamentation, coming more from the material itself, brick. And there are a lot of beautiful details, very refined details in this building that I think are worth pointing out. So it starts with a sharp edge, and then it goes up 17 floors, gradually ending up in a rounded cornice. I think these very small details are quite impressive and quite important when you talk about architecture, because this is about refinement. This is also ornamentation, but a different type of ornamentation. I would compare this to a sculpture that works with clay and cuts off pieces, perhaps. Not so figurative. And I think perhaps that's the reason why people misunderstand the age of the building or read it differently. Here, this is the place where the two parts kiss each other, and you can clearly see that the left part is, the steel structure is completely covered with plaster and ceramic to protect the steel from fire, of course, but also you see that it's a complete different type of vocabulary. While Burnham and Root chose to do everything from the same material and to get all their expression from the sculpting of the brick, Holabird and Rush used a lot of, I would say, Greek motifs. Now, before I end up in talking too long about this, I will also tell that for us, these elements that I was just pointing out are quite inspiring elements. The misunderstanding of the age of something in architecture, so that it does not necessarily need to be something brand new, but you could also, let's say, think, oh, has this building been here already for a while, or is it new? That is something that we actually like as a quality, because it means that it is also very rooted and also could have been there already for quite a while. So in our practice, we tend to use historical precedents also because of proven or a forgotten status. So we see this more as an operational tool than something as a justification, I would say. So as a moment of inspiration, we use old traditional examples as well as modern architecture to reflect on and to respond to and to learn from. So I think projects in our practice might not look the same or have a clear style. We also, I would say, have an attitude of working. So using conventions and historical examples is an important element to avoid making incidents, we think, or doing all kinds of inventions. Instead of that, we rather seek for passing on and bringing in an eclectic, light, and playful way, think about how the history of architecture can be reused and recycled again. Now, I have to tell you something about this word, threefold presence, that is coined by a French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur. And we found this beautiful formulation, threefold presence, where he describes the idea that stands for articulating a relationship with the presence of the past, the presence of the present, and the presence of the future. And Mr. Ricoeur also saw it as a merit of true action that all these three dimensions can be brought together in one singular moment. Now that is beautiful, we thought. So when thinking on architecture, working on architecture, reflecting on it, talking about it, the idea of threefold presence is actually rather in front of our minds. And I'll show you some projects now. You've been patient. So one building it's an older building. It's in the southeast of the Netherlands, close to the German border. And this is actually a small village, or I would say town. And in this town, we were asked to make a landmark. And the landmark is a bit of a strange symbol, I would say, because it does not have a very clear function other than to be an emblem or an identity of this small village. So this is what we saw when we entered this village. A parking lot as the most central space in this town. And around the parking lot there was a strip of shops. And we were a bit disappointed, but then we knew that that this whole town center would be redesigned and that the parking place would disappear and that there would be some new elements there. And then when we were asked to join this competition and make a proposal for a landmark, we started to collect examples from the environment. It has an old mining history, so we looked at industrial structures, we looked at water towers, we looked at tall, characteristic buildings that were in the environment. It took us a while to understand that that was only one side of the story, because the other side of the story was it needed to be a civic prominent building on the market square, attracting public. And in the Netherlands, in Germany, and also in Belgium, you have on the market square, you have these wage buildings, historical buildings that are not religious, also not, let's say, representing power, like the town hall. But they are about trade, so where the waging was taking place in former days. And these buildings have very particular forms. They are very small, but try to be very important. They have strange proportions, they have a narrow footprint, and then are very vertical and are richly ornamented. And they have a very active ground floor and most of the time a more quiet administrative first floor. And this is one of the elements you can find on virtually every market square, or a lot of market squares in the Netherlands. So we thought, if we want to implement a new landmark building, let's also look at this. So this was our first proposal. And this proposal is based on the idea that you have a house, and on top of that house, we have a tall tower, which is more abstract. Actually, two towers to make the building look a bit more substantial. It has a very simple scheme with a square as the basic form, and then on top, two small towers. One low tower and one high tower. We saw this in all old fortresses, that in order to enter the top of the tower, you have a small house on top of that, and that allows you to enter the roof or the balcony dry. So this is the whole configuration of the building, and this is the building how it's standing there. This is not a rendering, it's a very clean picture. But nowadays, it's now I would say, the focal point of the market square. And we wanted it to be a festive building. So it's a brick building, and the brick building is connected to the local habit of building in brick. The Netherlands is actually located in a delta, in a river delta, and the brick is a very common and normal, conventional element for making buildings. But this is actually a concrete structure that is covered with brick. And the concrete structure is not made out of beams and columns, but it's just in situ poured walls. So everything you see here in brick is actually, you could say, ornamentation or decoration, or creating order in a building. And we knew that it would be an all-sided small building, and you could compare it to a campanile, as you can find them on market squares in Italy, for example. Yet this one is very rooted in its place. All the ornaments you saw on the facade are also, let's say, borrowed from the environment where the bricklayers are making all kinds of ornamentations in the brickwork. And it's a very simple scheme, as you can see. 1/4 is occupied by services, the rest is open for a bar, because that was one of the questions that we were struggling with during the competition. What should actually be the function of this building? It's a folly, perhaps, because it's empty. And we proposed that there would be a bar, but it did not immediately contain a bar. That came later. But the idea is that you enter the structure and you say hi to the bartender, and then you're allowed to go up. And then you enter up the balcony, and then you step from one tower to the other tower, the tall tower here, which is non-insulated, and then you walk all the way up, and then you have a beautiful view over the environment. And then you see that that the neighboring villages, they all have their own old church tower, which makes them visible on the horizon. And this is a new town, so this town is from the 60s and did not have such a symbol. So we thought that the people would be very happy with this a new emblem in their market square. And we used also patterns. So we first learned during our studies that you cannot paint a brick, but here we did do that. We painted the brick, and therefore it's actually a red building that we painted with green slurry or cement. And therefore we could make all kinds of patterns over the facade. And nowadays it's a bar, but it was vacant for at least 2 years, but because it was not immediately functioning as a bar, which of course was a bit of a pain for us, because the emblem is there, but simultaneously it did not completely function as a civic building, which was public and open for everyone. So again, it's an all-sided building, and we treat all sides virtually the same, with small iterations, with small changes. And we make changes in the brickwork. The pattern changes also in the brickwork. Here we use a Brazilian bond in the brickwork to let the air flow through. And here we actually change the pattern from a green pattern to a red pattern. And it's a festive building, I would say, and we do things that are, of course, not allowed. When you make an arch, you cannot split the arch by a column, But that also explains that the first order of the columns and the beams is the most important one. And here you can see the top view, where people actually have a beautiful view over the surroundings and over the natural park. And you see some of the church towers there. Now, here you can also see that on the left side, you see the buildings from the 60s, and these are the new buildings. So in our mind, we did not want to, let's say, choose for these buildings or for these buildings, but actually wanted to balance a bit in between with the vocabulary of this new building. So I tell you something about another small building. That's the Atlas House. That's located in Eindhoven in the south of the Netherlands. It's a small house. So sometimes we do small houses, sometimes we also do bigger housing, but the smaller structures require actually the same amount of blood, sweat and tears, I would say. It's here in the south, and Eindhoven is a city well known for the electricity company of Philips. And in Eindhoven there is a transition taking place where old factory buildings are being transformed and being inhabited, and then new buildings, housing blocks are added to it. Our clients bought a small piece of land here, and that was along a real beautiful old estate with an old country house of the family of Philips that started the factory. And they had been living there for many ages. And at a certain point, it was sold, and nowadays it is going to be a park. So the people that bought the plot here and asked to design the building are, let's say, now all of a sudden living on the edge of a beautiful park, which is containing old beautiful trees, and that was quite a driving force to design this small structure. So we asked our clients, you have a small plot, you have a big wish for many square meters, you have a small budget, would you like to have a small house like a bungalow type, where we fill out the whole ground floor and you make a patio in the middle, or would you like to have a tower house so that you can actually walk around your house and still have a bit of garden around it? And they chose for the second. So we made a tall structure with a very limited footprint, resulting in a house that you have to inhabit over 3 floors. And the most, I would say, private part is the top. So what we then do in our practice is we make a sort of image that is our dream, how we would love the building to be. And we had quite some discussions with the client for turning the house on the plot, because by turning it, you would be turned away from your neighbors, because we knew that sooner or later the neighbors would arrive. It's a very simple scheme. There was a very limited budget for this structure. So we call it a house of rooms. So every room is the same in plan. 5 rooms per floor, 2 big rooms, 3 small rooms. The middle room is occupied by the stairs. The other rooms are more, let's say, used for servicing spaces. And that's also the way we conceptualized this building, as a group of rooms. So, and then we said, wouldn't it be good if the rooms have their own identity by means of height? So we individualize every room by giving different heights to the rooms, and that you would always be very aware when you cross from one room to the other room, that would be a transition that you notice, that you are aware of. That's an inside story, of course, because on the outside you have another story to tell. We consider the facade as a mask to the outside world, something we learned from Adolf Loos, for example, where the outside does not necessarily has to reveal what is inside. So the inside of the building contains all kinds of different heights. and therefore it is a very small and limited footprint with very a small amount of square meters, and then still it becomes, let's say, vivid by making all kinds of jumps and changes in ceiling heights. And that actually gives you always, makes you aware of going from one room to the other room. There are always walls and steps and jumps in the ceiling that make you aware of this. This is how the building started. So, all alone on the edge of the beautiful estate between the crowns of the trees, it would be standing there without any neighbors. So this looks, of course, a bit like an alien. But also for this building, I dare to say that it's very contextual, because it is very precisely positioned in this context in such a way that it can actually survive for a long time. And it's also built out of very local materials. So again in brick, and again we started to paint the brick by making a distinction in a plinth of the building and then an upper part of the building which is light and a bit more textile. It has a tactile quality because the joints are bulbing out. And it takes some time to, let's say, come to a decision. Nowadays we're a bit more efficient, but when we were working on this project, we needed to make tests, quite a lot of tests. This is a selection of the tests we did. This is not everything. And it's also good to share your inspirations, I think. So on our table we had the imaginary friend of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. And they showed this very simple structure of the fire station. And they did something very daring, I would say, by drawing a white surface that did not obey to the shape of the building. No, the white surface stops before the end of the building and here ignores the window. It looks clumsy, but it also makes you very aware of the white surface that makes its own emblem on the facade. So that's a bit what we took from and learned from Venturi Scott Brown. But also there's this tradition in Dutch housing where you make a brick structure and you embellish this and ornament this with all kinds of plaster ornaments, like a keystone, like layers here, horizontals, and all kinds of elements to make the building look a bit more important, so to say. So this movement of decoration with plaster is something that is all around. So we also started to embellish the facade with keystones. But of course these keystones are symbols that are not really valid anymore, because we use lintels on top of the openings, and these lintels make the keystone move up a bit. And sometimes the keystones start to wander around over the facade and become an element of composition. Nowadays, the neighbors have arrived and the garden has already grown a bit further. And here, when you start to paint the facade with one film only of white slurry, then these also becomes, actually the reliefs of the window also become an ornament, I would say, where you leave it uncovered. And all these small things, along with the joints, give a total tactile building, I would say. So people pass by and ask to the clients, is the building finished already? And they feel slightly uncomfortable with it, but we think that it's a beautiful way of adding tactility to a building. And this took quite some efforts to find the right joint. We learned this also from the Scandinavian architect Lewerens, for example. And I'll take you back into the house. There's a stairs, and these stairs go up. But sometimes they also have to go down again in order to go up again to the roof. And here you can see the garden. And now you can also understand why we have these white surfaces around the entrances to indicate where the main entrance is, with a table in front. And you can also see how the combination with the green is working. And that there's also another terrace here. The people now inhabit actually the first floor as their main living room. They work in their atelier on the ground floor and they sleep on the top floor. And this changes over time. So in 10 years' time, they might occupy and inhabit the ground floor. And this whole living changes again. So we started with a very rough idea that they have to finish this themselves in a year's time. So they started to inhabit the house like this, completely unfinished. And here you can actually experience how these transitions from one space to the other space work. And also what happens if you pair the windows over the corner. You get an oriel or a bay window. This is the dining room that's 4 meters high. And here again, these small ears of the wall, they actually are needed, I would say, to make you experience the transition from one room to the other room. This is the atelier, and this is the bay window. Slightly, the inhabitants start now to finish parts of the inner structure. They add their own layer of inhabitation, so they made a tailor-made kitchen and start to paint also the inside partially white. And now you can see how it's embedded in its environment with the neighbors that have arrived, which are also white. So all of a sudden, this building is not so alien anymore. Now, the last project I'm going to show you is the Park Pavilion. And this title, Composite Present Coherence, is about the way a building can actually perform in a very coherent way, but simultaneously have different faces or characters combined into one. So this is in the center of the Netherlands. There's in one of the biggest national parks, a new visitor center was required. And this visitor center was located in the middle, needed to be located in the middle of the park. It's a beautiful environment with forests and beautiful nature, quite intimidating for an architect, I would say, because it's so beautiful. How can you add something to that? And even there were other architects, I would say, famous architects that have built there before, which is even more intimidating, I would say. So there's a museum here. It's called the Kruller-Müller Museum. And there's a hunting lodge by Berlage, an architect, a famous architect from the Netherlands. And then we needed to make a new visitor center here with a large parking in the middle of the forest. So it would be an open place in the forest with a new visitor center. This is the museum. It's designed by Quist and by Henry van der Velde, a Belgian architect. And it's quite old already. It exists already for many years. It used to be, let's say, accommodating the collection of Van Gogh paintings. And this is the hunting lodge, as it's called, by Berlage. Now, again, we make an image of how we think the building should actually perform in these surroundings. And building in nature is, of course, difficult. But we came up with a building which is trying to be quite modest here, yet it should attract the visitors. So it houses 3,000 square meters, and it actually is a welcoming building. So people that actually enter the park find their place to drink something here, to get information about the park, to buy something in the shop, And if they want, there are also meeting rooms, so you can also meet up there. Now, 3,000 square meters is quite a big program to land in this open spot. So we did all kinds of efforts to make this building look a bit smaller. So we bent the building in order to never, let's say, experience the full length. We cut it up, the building, in two parts, so you won't see one roof, but always two roofs. And then we said, what kind of typology is this actually, this house? Is this visitor center is actually not a very clear typology. It can be anything. And then we said there's a hunting lodge. Perhaps this is a country house. And if we say it's a country house, then all of a sudden you have a strategy to design, because a country house has some very clear characteristics. And what we did, we found examples that we think that are important when you are talking about a country house. And we also shared these examples with our client and talked about it. So these three examples helped us during the design process of realization, which in the end took 7 years. So the first one is a tick-borne court that is by Sir Edwin Lutyens. It's in the UK. And what is so beautiful, I think, about this building is two things. One thing that is that the building is a country house in the middle of nature, but it does not mimic nature. It does not try to be a mountain. It does not try to be a hill or a part of the forest. It is a building, but there are all kinds of windows and vistas that connect the building with nature, with its surroundings. So that was something we learned. And then the other thing we learned from this is this beautiful emblem of the roofline that is visible from far away, which we think is necessary for a visitor center, that it's an emblem that you can find, that you can recognize from afar. The other reference was a very tiny, small church, or chapel, I should say, on a cemetery in Sweden, in Stockholm, that contains a surprise. It has a very simple roof. I will go here. You can easily miss it. It's very modest, very humble and low. And in the middle of the roof, or actually in the ceiling, we have a vaulted ceiling, something you cannot see from the outside. And then we saw this beautiful bar from La Caton Vasal, which is in Vienna, with a tiled ceiling. And this tiled ceiling is actually the carrier of the interior space, because everything changes. The furniture changes over time. A lot of, perhaps the use also of the space changes, but the tiles and the ceiling remain there. They are the most characteristic design feature, I would say. So these three things helped us actually quite a lot. So this is how the building is standing there nowadays, and it's being in full use now. And the building is having, I would say, 4 different faces. And these faces actually make it a bit of a collage. So a very emblematic front, which is like an emblem you see from far away. And it's a section building, I would say. So a building developed from the section instead of only from the functional plan. So it starts low, with a low roof. It's 3 meters, a roof line, where it's quite humble. And then you enter, and then you meet the vaulted ceiling of 8 meters high. Then you go through the stairs in a small corridor, and then you enter in the meeting rooms. And the meeting rooms all have their own individual ceilings. This is a section again. So this is what we learned from Asplund with the woodland chapel that I just showed you. And then you start wondering, of course, what happens here, and what happens here, and what happens here. That's what everybody asks us, of course, when we make this design. And then we said, these are the places where we can solve the installations, because we don't want to see all the installations. Why would we like to see them? Also, when you want to change, upgrade, and update them, we don't want to see them. This is a bit pixelated, but this is the main idea of the whole visitor center, is that it's one big space where everything starts to merge. So you enter here in the middle of the building, where the curve is located, and then either you go immediately to the restaurant, or you go to the shop and the information desk. You have to imagine that there are 600 to 700,000 visitors per year in this national park. And that means that a fraction of that also comes here in the visitor center. Not all of them, of course, but so on one hand, this is wants to be a country house, noble and beautiful and well made. On the other hand, it also needs to be very robust and needs to survive little children with peanut butter on their hands, and dogs that can enter, and people that walk around in the sand with sand under their shoes. So it needs to be also almost industrial, the building. On the first floor, we see the meeting rooms, and the meeting rooms have all their own identity and a very, let's say, functional strip in the middle. Now, this is a bit how it functions nowadays, and I will show you something of the interior. These are views without vegetation, but it tells you something about how we tried to make a color and material palette that combines good with the surroundings, with the sand, because this is a very hard baked brick, and this is aluminium. Of course, we started with different materials, with wood, but the client immediately said, the maintenance of wood in the forest is so heavy, we don't want this. So aluminium and brick are actually more sustainable in these surroundings. They survive longer. There are no other lights in the surroundings, so actually the visitor center is the light box, I would say. And of course, there's already a slight hint of what is happening inside. And this is what I just told you about the material. And nowadays, this is actually the only view where you can see the full length of the park pavilion. And we saw this head of the building, which is more closed and emblematic. And then the other side of the building, where all the logistics need to be solved. And of course, the whole restaurant needs to be, let's say, get their goods and all their stuff. So this is a part that you would normally not see as a visitor. And we use this strategy of using vertical ribs, always around the whole building. And sometimes we change the distance. So here the ribs are closer to each other, and here they open up. So it's actually something that binds the whole building together as one coherent building, together with its materials. But simultaneously, it also opens the possibility to have different faces or different conditions. Here again, you see the brick and the aluminium together. And here again, you can see how we try to work on the bay windows that you see here. Because when you make a banana building that is curved, you actually can choose for curved glass, which is rather expensive. But you could also say, I make a zigzag facade with straight planes. And that allows you actually to sit outside, covered from the rain, or to sit inside, closer to the light. So you have different conditions. And this is actually the park shop, where you can see that there's a very simple color, a material palette of wood and wooden paneling that refers to, I would say, also to the idea of a country house. And this is the restaurant, where you can sit close to the light. And the idea is always that you are fully connected with the surroundings, the beautiful nature that is offered. And the curve in the building makes a sort of separation. So if you sit here in the restaurant, you won't see much of the shop and the opposite. And on one side, you have the light coming in from the emblematic head. And on the other side, you have a very big fireplace, which is totally exaggerated. And it's completely tailor-made also. It's an emblem for being together, for sitting together, to find some warmth after a long stroll in the forest. The client actually insisted on making this, and we only blew it up to such an extent that it is actually becoming more of an emblem, completely tailor-made. And here we go up to the corridor and the meeting rooms, where you can see the same material palette. And I think an added value was brought by the light designers that made an installation that gradually changes over day, that is inspired by the idea that you walk over a path through the forest where the sunlight is shining through the leaves. Now, I want to finish off, because I think I've been talking already a bit too long. You have seen 3 quite tailor-made buildings with a public character, except for the second one, which is a private house. But in general, we work on urban architecture. And what do I mean by that is that we work a lot on housing. So we get invited to work on specials, a special corner in a city, a corner of a building that explains something about the hierarchy of a street, a smaller street and a bigger street where the building needs to be more present, and a smaller street where the building needs to blend in a bit more. We work on a small tower house, which is located on a market square. As you can see, it's still under construction, but this also shows that it is a sort of collage of a low building where the tower is landing on top and making a very characteristic orientation point. We're also working on housing blocks, social housing, where this is now, they're doing the groundworks now, so it will be finished in a year. This is a building in Hanover, which is currently paused, but it's also a substantial mixed-use building. And this is a social housing which is currently under construction, where we try to give meaning to modern ornaments by thinking in brick and making a brick structure beautiful by adding color to it and adding, let's say, optimism in social housing. So, and I'm talking tonight about projects that I did not do myself. Of course, we work together with many collaborators, and I thank you for your attention, and perhaps you have some questions.
Thank you for this very, very nice lecture. I think everyone here is very lucky to be seeing a piece of your mind and the way you work in Netherlands. It's really important and it's really special, especially because of, I think, the way you work in today's world is, it's not a very common way of working, sadly. And I think the first thing I want to mention that I want to ask you about is, throughout the work that you showed and the way you explained the work, there was a high level of understanding of classical architecture, I would say. And in 2024, maybe you're not hearing so many people make references to classical architecture, especially when they're talking about contemporary architecture. So maybe I would like to ask you the first question to be about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a nice question. The easy way out would be that all the modern architects that we love so much, like Le Corbusier, like Mies van der Rohe, were trained as classical architects, and you can see in their early work very classical buildings. So their deep knowledge and understanding and study of classical architecture is reflecting also in their more young and modern buildings. Yet they felt to the urge to progress and to step away from a literal translation of that. And now the tougher part comes in, that is that I think that the people after Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier started to embrace this modern architecture also, but somewhere perhaps some meaning has gone lost. And I find it interesting to reappreciate some of the values of classical architecture stripped from any political meaning, but that there are conventions and traditions in architecture that we can just recycle and reappreciate nowadays. That doesn't mean that I'm a classicist. I just think it's a bit ignorant to shove away a couple of 100 years of architecture and say I'm only interested in the last couple of decades or only in the future. I think that's not how life is. Life is more complicated, so it's a mixture of things, of old motives and new motives, and I think it's worth finding your own balance in this. I try to give shorter answers. Good? Okay.
No, I mean, it's important, and it's true, like all the modernist thought grew from understanding how we could reuse classical architecture. All the inspiration for Le Corbusier was from Greece or, yeah. Which brings me to my second question. Mm-hmm. I think throughout the projects that you showed, you started with the Monadnock building, and then you continued on to show your work, and we saw like different examples of how you can use brick. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very special way of working, especially in the Netherlands. If you're saying that it's like the local construction technique, how can you reuse this, and how can you redo it, or just use it in a way for it to have a breath of fresh air, kind of? Yes. Yeah. So in the Atlas House, we saw this, the squares above the windows.
Yeah, the keystones.
The keystones.
The lost
yes.
keystones.
And then they're above the window, and then slowly they start flying off in different locations, and then it becomes decorative. And this also connects to the classical architecture in some way, because you are referencing things, but then you're not too shy to play with it and just keep it playful and lighthearted in some way, which I think is very strong. And maybe you can talk about brick.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I can talk about brick for ages. Our brick is your tough stone, so to say. I mean, it is in the river delta you have sand and clay. Clay you can actually bake, or you can also not bake it, but then you have to really protect it from rain. So if you bake it, it is sustainable for centuries. And nowadays there are all kinds of valuable discussions about sustainability, and the brick is suffering from that as a bad example, because it actually eats energy in the baking process. But then when you start making a calculation, the brick actually is able to survive much longer than most other materials. And it's less polluting than, for example, or not less polluting. Concrete is more polluting. We're now doing two things in our practice. We're exploring ways to make the brick thinner, almost like a strip, and then it really becomes like a raincoat. And the other direction is simultaneously where we make the brick thicker, that it really becomes load-bearing again. And these are, for us, both very signs of the times and very inspiring, and it's very helpful to not be dogmatic about the truth of the brick, we think, because that can be very limiting. Sometimes it's useful to make solutions which are very thin and slender, knowing that it is not as sustainable as a full brick. And sometimes it's better to make something which is really more robust. I think in the first instance, we just need to be aware of that if we are done with the building, that we can, let's say, recycle it properly. That is an awareness that starts to grow and grow more. But to go back to the beginning of the brick, it is also a very common material that everybody understands. It has a size that everybody understands. It's very close to the handcraft. And of course, not every brick building is being made by hand. It is also prefabricated in many ways. But still, it has a size that people can relate to. So there's also a sort of cultural dimension to the brick, I would say, which is not everywhere the same, but in the Netherlands or in the Low Countries, this is part of building culture. But sometimes this is also very limiting for a design process as a design strategy to always tell that it should be firm and robust and standing on the ground. All the forces need to go down directly. While in some cases, like the first project that I showed, the landmark, the brick is not doing that. That's the concrete structure behind it. That's carrying the load. So the brick here is a raincoat, and the raincoat also has a sort of freedom to be perhaps a bit more imaginary or free. And that is something that you, as an architect, or everyone needs to decide for her or himself whether how much freedom is allowed. But I think that also, let's say, in historical architecture, you see moments of strictness and also moments of freedom. Renaissance is full of playfulness, I would say, and experiment. And perhaps it's helpful if you are restricted to some of the conventions, because then you also know when you are stepping away from these conventions. And sometimes, and now it becomes a bit more, more of a statement. Sometimes I have the feeling in contemporary architecture that we are actually longing for some more conventions to stick to, that we make things that people understand a bit better. Yeah.
And when you mentioned that now brick has become kind of like a coating and a finish, it's similar to how we are working with like tooth in Armenia, because now you just basically have like a very thin layer that people add on the outside, and if it is used on the inside of the wall, it's always covered with another layer on top, because they never do clean cut finishes on the outside. So it's interesting that you're experimenting, going really big with the brick or very slim.
Yeah. But there's a lot of technical explanation to that. For example, it takes a lot of efforts to make the brick appear like just a very simple flat structure. You need all kinds of steel and enforcement to keep the brick up. Well, if all of a sudden you say, hey, if we use the full depth of the brick, the brick structure can actually carry itself for 6 layers high or even 7 layers higher without the need of any steel reinforcement. And that is, I think, something that we now start to gradually explore, and that I think is interesting, because then the value of the brick becomes more explainable again. Yeah.
So maybe we can open it up for other questions from the crowd, if people have questions. Okay, we have a question over here.
Thank you very much for your, I must say, thought-provoking lecture. And so in the very beginning of your talk, you said that most of the European cities look alike and kind of merge together. I can agree with this statement, and I want to ask you a question. Now you're in Yerevan, and I don't know whether you had the time for exploring the city properly, but I want to ask whether Yerevan has this feeling of being merged or blending, and whether you have this feeling that you are lost here. Thank you.
Good question. The answer is no. I have. So this has been my second day in Yerevan. So my experience is young, but I am impressed by the coherence and the beauty of the city, and also by the layering of the city, that we can see old Yerevan, that we can see parts of Soviet relics actually that are, I think, buildings that you should really celebrate as a layer in time which has its own validity. And I see a new Yerevan arriving. And about the new Yerevan, I miss a bit of, let's say, rooting with double O, that it has real connection to a sense of place and a scale that makes Yerevan so beautiful. I think this is that's a bit what I try to illustrate with the story of Amsterdam, that the public opinion and appreciation of layers in a city change over time. So perhaps it requires a bit more time to find a key to build in Yerevan in a way that it relates to perhaps historical layers or more recent layers like the Soviet layer, for example, in order to develop into a layer that has its own standing and own conditions. Now I see some buildings that try to be quite generic, and that's something I do not like so much personally, but that does not spoil the party at all, because it was, again, I experienced the city as being very beautiful. Yes.
And I think in terms of the context of this seminar, I'd like to frame the question a bit away from architecture, and if you could talk a little bit about the process of working in craft, and in your case it's builders, but there's joiners and others, and what that relationship and that workmanship is like in terms of that. And the second part of that question is, what would be a piece of advice you would give your younger self launching into a career of design or architecture, and what would be your 2 words or whatever?
Okay. So the first, both very interesting questions, because the first one is about the meaning of craftsmanship, and we can actually see craftsmanship as something, at least you will come back, promised? Good. As craftsmanship as something that is very expensive and only for rich people that have a lot of money, and they can actually afford craftsmanship. That's how it works in the Netherlands. So to talk about craftsmanship is not so easy when you talk about social housing, for example. So I would dare to say in the Netherlands that craftsmanship has virtually died. So we have to search for methods that do not mimic craftsmanship, but we have to find new strategies of refinement within an industrialized, standardized process, because honestly, the architect is proposing assembled buildings of an assembly of products that are standardized and brought together in a building. So we have to, of course, when we do furniture design in our practice, I did not show, or exhibition design, then craftsmanship and tailor-made products are very normal. But in big housing schemes, it's sometimes you can actually, because of the amount, for example, we're now designing a scheme in Amsterdam for 400 units, and then you can actually say, oh, if it happens 400 times, you can make a piece which is perhaps out of the standard, because it multiplies 400 times. But in general, it's a very hard thing to obtain. So therefore, I said we have to find new ways of perhaps ornament or new ways of craftsmanship. So the loss of craftsmanship is something we need to compensate as architects by not getting rid of the refinement that craftsmanship brought. So that's a long answer. And then the other thing, so I now got a bit of time to think about the other question. So I would actually suggest two things. One is for young practices to formulate an agenda that actually can be provocative, but can also be modest, but an agenda. And if you, or call it a mission statement, that's a bit more corporate, but I call it an agenda. And the agenda will most certainly change after a couple of years, but it's okay. You've written it down once in the beginning of your career, and then you can always reflect on it later, and perhaps you need to change it, or it's still valid. And the second thing is that I think that it's very important to try to make things as quick as possible in your career. So to find ways to make things that can be very small things, like a table, but it could also be the transformation of an existing space. In the Netherlands, there are quite some young practices that need to, that actually produce a lot of paper before they are actually engaging with making dirty hands, so to say. Because the making of dirty hands, I mean another word would say, I don't know, it's a sort of literal translation from Dutch, but the baptism of fire, the first encounter you have with the pain of making compromises of your design is something which I think is very helpful. And welcome back. So, yeah.
I have a question. What inspires your architectural designs, and how do you translate that inspiration into your projects? Thank you.
The simple answer would be that I like to study architecture. I like to understand why things have happened 500 years ago, and I like to understand why things will happen in the next forthcoming months. And I try to treat these equal. So I try to be not too dogmatic. I also want to engage with contemporary questions of spatial planning, but I also want to know architects from the past. And I used to go to libraries to find architects that I did not know about, and I'm still happy that I did, because you can't always find them on the internet. Some of them are still hidden in books, you know, these paper things, and therefore I also like to collect these paper things, building up knowledge about architecture. I once heard a museum director tell, he said, yeah, knowledge can also be very intimidating for others. So he didn't want to show off with his knowledge. And I think that is a bit something that might be misunderstood, that it's not necessary to know 5 books before you start designing it, your building, I mean, your project. But I think it helps when you charge and inform a design with some of the knowledge of things that have happened before. That's inspiring for me.
In what degree, for you, acceptable context, conceptualizing the context? At what degree you think it's acceptable? Because my concern is sometimes we do this, we talk, we try to implement the context just to show our colleagues, not to the society. So when we go beyond, we conceptualize it a lot, then for society it's not clear, okay, why these folks did design like this. So I would like to have your opinion on that. Thanks.
Yes, that's a nice question, and also a complicated question, because it is, so one aspect is that I think it is good to use, to not conceptualize context, because that is one of the driving reasons to embrace, let's say, conventions in architecture and to embrace traditions in architecture, because I think that they relate to the general public opinion, that people understand certain older buildings better because they've been growing up with them or they've been around for so many years, that people feel more comfortable with them instead of modern architecture, which is abstract and feels sometimes like an alien ship that has landed. And so in that sense, in our approach, I think, of embracing conventions, I would say there's also an idea that we want to make buildings that are useful tools for everyday life, not temples, so to say, that are abstract and distant. And that means that, there's always a level of conceptualization, because we also import motifs from all over the world in a building that is perhaps very intuitive or very something you can actually attack or have a long discussion about. And that is indeed the conceptualization part of it, that sometimes examples do not come from the neighborhood that you build in, but you find an example in Brazil or somewhere else that actually answers the question that you're dealing with. Is it then or is it then contextual? No. But simultaneously, the whole appearance of the building is still, I would say, contextual, because you always try to anchor it and to make relations. But I would say contextualization is something in our practice we don't try to take too literal, and that is indeed making, that's opening up quite a debate about how conceptual it is. I understand the question very well. It's not so easy to give a very clear answer to that. Do you have a follow-up question, perhaps, after what I said?
Actually, no, but because we had similar discussion at Library for Architecture that we founded with some fellow architecture studios, offices.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one of the quite how they say, strong and heated kind of debates that we had. So it was do we have any other instruments rather than the construction material and decoration that we can talk, that helps architect to blend the architecture to the context in a literal way, not in a kind of conceptual way. So for that reason, and I see in your work, both of them, playing and working with materials, also with the decoration a bit, which is really rare in these times, during this period. So for that reason, I thought that your feedback can be interesting. So
Yeah,
frankly,
but
I don't have the answer for that too.
no, but
yeah.
please allow me to add one more element to it, and that is something we do not always manage to implement, but thinking about typologies is always also a very strong element of making a connection. Do we help society with this? Does it create a bigger understanding in society when you embrace typologies that you already have found in an environment? Not sure, but I think it's stepping away from alienating. I think it's actually embracing typologies that have already, let's say, proven its values. And I think, yeah, it's a word. A typology is a word that in the Netherlands nowadays is not being used that often anymore, which is, I think, a problem, because I think it's a carrier of knowledge, architectural knowledge. So I think we should continue using words like typology. But I think that is also, besides decoration and materials, I think typology is also a way to relate to a context.
Okay, so this is the final question, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Okay, I know you've been in Armenia for only like 2 days, but as much as you saw, is there anything in our architecture that might inspire you to like use in your future projects, maybe some specific things that like you can tell people that I inspired from Armenia?
Wow, that's a nice question. Yeah, I saw black and orange tooth combined in a facade, and it looks so incredibly brilliant. I mean, literally, yeah, poppy almost. So intense that I found very inspiring, and indeed, but that is a very surface-based observation, which is a bit of an easy answer. I think to give a more profound answer to your question, I think I would honestly need to think a bit longer, which does not mean I'm not returning home without any inspiration, but it just means that it needs to land a bit. I cannot, let's say now, do the trick of naming 5 points of inspiration, but I must say, I mentioned it already a couple of times, that also the layer of, let's say, the metro station here nearby, that and this beautiful cinema complex, that is also something which is really beautiful in a city, to have these monumental gestures that are really that create their own context. Actually, I think that's also quite inspiring. Yeah.
Very short. More a relationship question. How is it working with the people in the Netherlands in terms of like client relationship? How much freedom do they give you, or do you impose on them? Because there was a lot of lightness in your architectural language and a lot of play or playfulness, and I wanted to know if it's something that your clients are respecting and allowing, or?
Well, you have to imagine that the conversations with clients develop in different itineraries or different routes. So for the park pavilion that I showed, I immediately sensed that the client was an educated client and wanted to know more than just, let's say, the technical solution for problems, but the client also wanted to know, really demanded a deep understanding for what architecture, what the architecture of his, in this case, new building would be. So therefore, we immediately also showed these 3 references and talked about it from the beginning, and they were actually helping us throughout the design process as a red line. But the margins in social housing are much smaller, and the people are involved in these projects are much more trained, because the client of the park pavilion, this was his first building he made, and probably also his last building, because it's not necessary to build more in the park. but social housing is a machine that needs to be continued, and the people involved are very professional, and they know. Some of them are trained like architects and then became a client and say, hey, you give away half a square meter there. Do I need to pay for that? So there's a lot, there's a different type of discussion there on the table. And I think it is important as an architect to be able to have different types of languages. I think you always need the agenda for your own internal design process, but also need to be aware of the agenda of your client so that you can anticipate to that, and then make sure that it merges together in a good balance. And then the other thing that is helpful in the Netherlands is that there is it's not only the architect that is involved in a design process. We also have a committee in, for example, Amsterdam, where it's very powerful, because a lot of people want to build buildings, and the profits are quite high, so that the municipality has several commissions that actually judge the quality of the architecture. There are architects themselves, actually fellow architects that I could also meet in a different constellation, but they judge the work I'm doing, and they say, this is not good enough, or they say, this is something I can't follow, what you're now talking about. And then there's also an urbanist from the municipality, and sometimes also an urbanist from the client side involved. So there are quite some levels of involvement that make that sometimes also protect you as an architect. And I think that whole thing is a sort of culture of building culture, which in a country like the Netherlands has become a sort of tradition, because we are used to plan the country in a very strict way, because we have to defend ourselves against the water, so we need to plan everything. So we also plan our buildings, and we also talk and regulate that. Yeah.
Okay. So we have to wrap everything up. Thank you so much, Job, for the amazing lecture, amazing talk. Thank you, Creative Armenia, for organizing this talk.